Great to see everybody. Welcome to today's seminar series. I think I know most of you in the room, but for those who are new, my name is Deborah Yashar. I'm a professor in the politics department in SPIA and also the director of Pierce. Today is the third in a series of faculty panels that we've been organizing on global existential challenges. This is a relatively new format where we're trying to bring together Princeton faculty for this year to speak to one another on issues that we think are key and global and obviously also existential. The title is quite ample. Sometimes I think it's overly hubristic. I'll say that out loud. It's arguably overly ambiguous about each term: development, precarity, global crisis. Yet I think the capaciousness of these terms actually opens up space for us to talk to one another across disciplines, across regions, to think about the global crises that are before us as we think about, in particular, development and precarity. I don't need to repeat all of this, but let me just remind you, we are facing multiple crises. Maybe our colleagues will highlight even more, but let me note, of course, we're facing environmental crises that have upended economies locally and globally, whether or not we're thinking about land affected by flooding, fire, and desiccation, whether or not we're thinking about air affected by all kinds of climate crises, water, et cetera. All of these have created development challenges, but also have had impact on the precarity for so many around the world. On top of that, we also know that COVID and war have been part of our contemporary landscape, affecting life cycles, labor markets, businesses, and supply chains, and so much more. The war has had, in particular, a devastating impact this year, but layered on top of COVID, it has been yet another crisis that has had multiplier effects. And we all know that while some have benefited in this context economically, the inequalities that have been generated, the distortions to certain development patterns have been striking and raised the question for us to think about not only what has happened in terms of rising inequalities, rising challenges, but possibly also opportunities to think about new visionaries for ways of going forward. So there is a lot before us. Today will not answer all these questions, but we hope it will be part of an ongoing set of conversations. And we're so fortunate today to have three people to speak with us. They are colleagues who are well known to all of you who are here. Of course, you're here because they are the highlights of the show. And so I won't go into depth about each of their bios, which are all known to you, but I'll introduce them briefly. So first, Miguel Centeno will be speaking with us. He's the Musgrave Professor of Sociology, and also the Vice Dean at SPIA. I should also note, since we're standing here in the context of Pierce, that he's also the founding director of Pierce, the first person who led the institute. He also is the founder of PUPS, amongst many other initiatives on campus. And as you know, his research interests and publications and teaching are expansive themselves, whether or not we're talking about his work on states, war, capitalism, nations, and of course, his path-breaking work on global systemic risk, which I think he'll be talking about today. Second, Tomás Fujiwara has agreed to speak with us as well. He's an associate professor of economics and public affairs, and also is the co-director of the Brazil Lab, which, as you know, has been in this room many times this year and in the years past, because they've generated so many important conversations about what's happening in Brazil and also its implications for the world. His research has been quite significant, particularly focused on issues in political economy. So I won't list all the publications, but I'll note that while he's an economist, he also has worked on elections and voting alongside labor markets and gender, health and development, and his work has focused on Latin America, of course, but also on the Philippines, Benin, and the United States. So again, quite a comparative scope. And then finally, last but not least, is Leonard Wantchekon, who's the James Madison Professor of Political Economy and also Professor of Politics and International Affairs. Like Tomás, he is situated in the research domain of political economy and has had significant impact on our discussions about economic history and their implications for development outcomes, in particular the impact of colonialism and other historic patterns. And he's contributed to many literatures, including on clientelism and state capture, the resource curse, and democratization, with a focus on Africa, but of course also in comparative perspective. It should be noted that Tomas and Leonard have actually co-authored in some of their work as well. He's also the founder of the African School of Economics, and so has both had a footprint like our other two colleagues here on campus, but the scope is really quite global in terms of what they're doing. So I want to thank all three of them for agreeing to speak. Let me just note a few ground rules. I should have noted that this is actually being taped, so of course be mindful of where you are, recognizing that this will be generated. We've and put online. Secondly, some of the mics are apparently not working as well today as they might have. So when you pose your questions at the end, we're going to ask you to speak as loudly as you can, and then our speakers will try and summarize and restate them for the video. And last, our speakers will each have about 15 minutes. If you see me hand waving, it's just to remind them of the time, and then we'll open it up for discussion. So please, let's give a warm round and welcome to our speakers, and thank you. Miguel, you're up.
Can someone show me how I get to?
I think, okay. I don't know, but I'm going to guess it's this. And
thank you. Hi, everybody, and thank you so much for coming. I wanted to play off the existential challenge, and I didn't get to put this on a slide, but I just thought I'd begin with a quote from Albert Camus, since this is an existential challenge, and it's, should I kill myself or have a cup of coffee? I think that's something we should all wake up and think about a little bit. So today, and I'm going to apologize. Oh my gosh, what is this thing? I'm going to apologize because some of you have heard much of this other times. I'm sorry, I'm a one-trick pony. This is all I talk about now. But let me introduce you to a project that we have been working on for the last decade, which is on global systemic risk. And basically, what we think about is that globalization is nothing but one big plumbing system. If you think about globalization as movements of people, of money, of goods, of energy, of cultural items, etc., think of these as just, if you drive down I-95, there's whatever, the regeneration plant or whatever it is right before Newark Airport, and you see just millions of pipes all interlocking.
If you're going to walk, could you just pop this mic on? Just so we can hear you.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, sorry.
No problem. Usually my voice doesn't need much help.
But yeah, for the recording, we won't have your voice.
Okay.
So if you're here, it's good.
Okay. So again, think of globalization as just a plumbing system with all these things going through. It's actually even more complicated than the regeneration plant because we can really think of these as plasma flows. And the intensity of each flow is going to start having an effect. So again, think of the billions upon billions of connections. Now, these are not necessarily new. Ever since Homo sapiens conquered the planet, let's say 70,000 BC or so, we have been global. We are all global. But what's really changed is the speed at which these transactions take place and their complexity and their interaction and the sheer amount of them. And you can see on any kind of measure, whether it's international phone calls, international trade, tourism, etc. Around 1990, you see this incredible sort of hockey stick effect of it accelerating. And for the last 30 years, we have been living in this global world. What we're interested in is we're interested in the causes and the consequences of this global web. We want to, in a sense, map this web and see how the different parts are related to one another. And most importantly, we want to really think about what are the consequences of this web and the centrality of this web to our lives. So we think of globalization as a complex adaptive system. Complex adaptive systems arise endogenously out of the interactions of components and have collective behaviors that cannot be reduced to those of their components. This is really essential. When you have a complex adaptive system, you can no longer predict the outcome of the system by even some additive version of the characteristics of the individuals or the agents in it. It produces these kinds of interactions, these relationships produce in and of themselves produced in and of themselves new kinds of effect, new possibilities. They create these new dynamics, and properties emerge from these. Okay, properties that would not be predicted based on the individual characteristics, but the fact that we have put all these things together produces outcomes that we might not expect. Now, these systems look just fine, just dandy, but they often hide a great deal of fragility. And you can talk about a complexity disaster. That is a system that is so complex that it is bound to collapse, if you will. And that's what we're particularly interested in. So again, modern systems, and this is important, and you'll see, I'll come back to this in a second. Modern systems are incredibly efficiently designed, and they are designed to exploit the benefits and efficiencies resulting from specialization of labor, economies of scale, collective knowledge, and information sharing. The world food production system is much more efficient than it was 30 or 40 years ago. Almost any single social creation is much more efficient now. The problem is that we might have made them too efficient, that we've prized optimality to a certain extent, and we have created a global system based on this, based on this globalization, all right? And we've become extremely dependent on that. We no longer, if you measure the distance between where the food is grown to where you are consuming it, what might, sorry.
No.
Okay, thanks. Really? I sound like the voice from God.
You can lower the mic a little bit, but help with the
Sorry. There will be global crisis. How's that?
Yeah, and just, I think if you don't cross the podium, it'll be okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll just, you know what? Let me just sit here. Let me just stand here. Because the voice from God is not great. Yeah. Okay. So we have this very, very efficient system on which we have become dependent, and that's essentially the motivation for our research group. Have we created a really efficient and wonderful mousetrap, but a mousetrap that's going to chop our fingers off if not worse? Systems that reach the threshold, okay, of this complexity are said to be edge of chaos. That is, a small internal perturbation or a small external perturbation can bring down the system. We're not so interested in external perturbations. I'm not so in, the sociology of the asteroid hitting. What can you do, okay? Or a volcano. What we're interested in is endogenous sources of risk inside that system. That the very fact that the system is functioning in a particular way might lead to danger. And you'll see what I mean in just a second. And the big battle is efficiency versus fragility. I always ask my students, would you like a 1967 Volkswagen Bug, or would you like a 2022 Porsche? Usually the answer is they would want the 2022 Porsche. It's wonderful. It's better furniture than I have in my house, better sound system. You can get the temperature down to 69.1 as you race 150 miles an hour. That's great if you're in the Autobahn, okay? But what if you're in the Sahara? That Porsche is going to be your death. Because if you've ever operated any of these machines, if the heating isn't quite right, if the radio isn't quite right, the damn thing won't even start. All right, while the Volkswagen Bug, my wife had one, a 1967 Volkswagen Bug, and the passenger side, the floor corroded. So she had to put 2x4s where the passenger's legs would go like this. Imagine trying to drive a Porsche with 2x4s instead of a passenger seat. All right? So a Volkswagen, it's not as efficient, it is not as wonderful, it's not as fast, it's not as comfortable as a Porsche 22, but you can fix it with duct tape. It's a very simple operating system, and depending on where we are, again, if you're on the Autobahn, you want the Porsche. But if there's any possibility of a risk, you want that Volkswagen. And let me show you a couple of examples of how a Volkswagen might not be a bad idea, okay? And just taking from the last 20 years. we can see how small perturbations, or relatively small perturbations, inside the system can cascade throughout the world. We have 9/11, a terrorist incident in Manhattan and in Washington, D.C., produces a military struggle that we're still sort of experiencing, and which completely changed the geography, the political geography of the Middle East. The Las Vegas real estate market could bring down some of the largest global banks in the world. We've got, I don't speak Icelandic, I have no idea how to pronounce that, but we have the famous volcano. You had this, just a volcano erupting, not next to a city or anything. It just happens to be, it's right underneath the North Atlantic Highway for air traffic. And that destroyed air traffic for about a week. With all sorts of repercussions from that. We have the Arab Spring. The death of a street food vendor ends up shaking up the Middle East, and we saw an emulation effect. We saw how these what used to be local events become regional and then global. You've got migration, the Syrian civil war. Again, with all the tragedy, the reason we became really aware of the Syrian civil war is because of the consequences, and one of them being this migration crisis in the 2010s to Europe, which produced, some would say, the emphasis on national and populism. We have COVID-19, did I say more, from a small market in China to stopping the entire world. You've got supply chain disruptions. A couple of years ago, when the ship got stuck in the Suez Canal, all of a sudden supplies, and this is the important part, it's not just the immediate supply, it's the widget that you need to make the widget that needs to make the widget. Once you interrupt those, you get a crisis. Let me just show you how a small event in a small part of the world can have these repercussions, and you'll understand why we're doing this. And we can talk about Ukraine. Now, battling in Eastern Europe, okay, is unfortunately not a new thing. It is not a novelty, okay? Bloodlands, etc. Why was this so important? Why was a relatively conventional war between Russia and Ukraine all of a sudden become a global issue? Let's look at it. Energy. First of all, because you have this war, all of a sudden German heating and German manufacturing is threatened, because the Russians are going to, they have played games with the gas supply, with the petroleum supply, etc. So what ended up being a localized war, in a sense, starts affecting the world, starts affecting oil prices, which might have affected the American election that just happened. So again, a relatively small event with all sorts of global implications. Ukraine and the oil prices. You've seen the sharp, the steep increase in oil, again, which has been felt throughout the world. I never thought that soybean oil was sunflower oil was particularly important. It ends up that for some cuisines in some parts of the world, the availability of that sunflower oil is critical for cooking, because much of the production of that is concentrated in Ukraine. All of a sudden you have literally a nutritional crisis in parts of the world 2,000 or 3,000 miles away from Ukraine that have really, didn't even receive anything from Ukraine, but all of a sudden the sunflower oil increases in price. You also have rises in the price of basic cereals. Okay, this is partly speculation, partly the shift in demand. You actually have a nutritional food crisis in parts of the Middle East and North Africa because of the interruption, again, of a relatively small conflict, all of a sudden having repercussions thousands and thousands of miles away. Fertilizer prices. This is a particularly important one. I know nothing how exciting, but actually fertilizer is not only critical for the production of food. I want you to consider what's going to happen in a year when the absence of that fertilizer has very serious repercussions on global food production. So if we think we're having a food crisis now, just wait until next year when there isn't that fertilizer as an input to produce what we might eat. People. I found it, and this is with all due apologies and respect to Ukrainians in the audience anywhere, I found it a little bit offensive, the treatment of the Ukrainian crisis compared to, for example, how many BBC correspondents were in Addis Ababa or Tigray province 6 months ago. We all watched on BBC as these correspondents would sit around going, this is happening in Europe. As in, if it wasn't happening in Europe, it would be okay. If brown people were dying, that's all right. No one can see the difference so much as in Poland, that has been lauded for welcoming all these Ukrainians. Well, 6 months before the war, there were literally thousands of Afghanis and Syrians dying of cold that could not enter into Poland. But it's had this effect. And I'm sure I wouldn't want to be the mayor of a small border town in Poland and the kinds of strains this has put on their food systems, on their health systems, etc. It's destroyed the ruble and has had all sorts of repercussions. Actually, one that's not been explored is a banking crisis in Cyprus, because so much of the Russian money has been pulled out of Cyprus into, and who knows where, maybe into FTX. Wouldn't that be funny? And so here is conflict all of a sudden is affecting the Cyprus financial industry. Borders. We might have a change in borders. All of a sudden, there is much more energy and autonomous movements in the eastern part of Russia. There's a possibility of permanent shifts in borders across the continent. There's the environmental damage that has been done. An environmental damage that we have no idea what it is yet. And it's not only extends to the territory of Ukraine, but should you have, by the way, this is from Chernobyl, don't be scared. There's not a radiation. There could have been. So again, a war leading to an industrial accident, leading to an environmental disaster for the entire world. And then, of course, there's the ultimate nightmare. That this apparently small, limited struggle could escalate. Certainly, those of us who, a couple of days ago, when it was still thought that it had been a Russian missile that landed in Poland, the danger index went way up as the possible repercussions of this. So, the challenges that we have are the following. We have to figure out some way of pricing fragility. Right now, price efficiency, and that's where is there a way of including fragility in the system? Price that sort of as an externality in a sense for any kind of transaction or any type of operation. Two, we are still living in a Westphalian world, okay, where citizenship and political decisions are based on a nation state, yet these are global problems. And we saw how well we can coordinate with each other with COVID, where everyone's first reaction was to just close their borders to everybody else. How do we resolve that? Third, we are who we are, okay? Nasty, brutish, some of us short, okay? We're selfish, we're opportunistic, and models that don't take into account this kind of reality, all right, are going to fail. We can't, the Elvis Costello song, What's So Funny About Peace, Love, and Understanding? Peace, love, and understanding, unfortunately, is not going to get us out of this. We have to understand what we're operating with. And we have three basic decisions to make. One, robustness versus resilience. You can't have both, because they're very expensive. Robustness is you try to prevent any bad thing from happening. Robustness is a wall, okay? Resilience is you know something bad is going to happen, but you have some plan to mitigate it. You have some reserves, in a sense. If the enemy breaches the wall, you can actually throw something. We have to make decisions about this. Robustness is a no-win strategy. We're not going to be able to prevent everything bad from happening to us. What we should be planning on is how we can deal with the consequences of that. Right now, most of our regulation is microprudential. For example, in banking, we look at individual banks. We look at individual players. If it's a firm, we're looking for individual safety concerns, et cetera. That may not be the issue anymore. What we really have to do is find out how we can regulate a set of relationships, not the individual players, but the entire system, and again, consider emergent properties, how those emergent properties might arise, regardless of any individual bad actor. We're still so focused on the bad actor, the selfish banker, the stupid crypto king, whatever it might be. We might not need, yes, 30 seconds. And the last one is, can we have some transparency about who wins and who loses? I believe that some of the nationalist populist backlash that we have received is we sold people a bill of goods about globalization, that globalization was going to lift all boats. Well, those of you who are familiar with Branko Milosevic's elephant curve know that some benefited, some did not. And yet that has never been addressed. All of our policies always want to have, it's very Panglossian. We want the best of all possible worlds for everybody. Policy, as I tell my MPA students, policy is about choices. Who's going to lose, who's going to win, and we have to accept that. And with that, if you want to be further depressed, you can look at risk.princeton.edu, where we have videos of various conferences we've had, white papers, and publications. And with that, thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Use the phone. This one here. Yeah. So, well, first of all, thanks everyone for coming, and thanks for the invitation. It's a pleasure to participate in this. So, as you can see in the map here, I'll talk a little bit about Latin America in particular. In a way, this is like a very, I would say even silly, non-serious, non-academic map. I took it from a magazine in Brazil. And what it's showing is, it put in blue all countries that have a right-wing government, and in red, all countries that have a left-wing government, right? Again, in 2018 and 2002. So again, flipping the colors of we use in the United States, red being sort of the left wing. There was sort of this red wave that swamped the continent in the last 3 years. Again, I'll say it's sort of not very serious because it's weird to say lump, what the Maduro regime does in Venezuela to what you say the Boric administration is doing in Chile. There's very different things. In the same ways, what say Ortega's doing in Nicaragua is definitely going to be very different than what say Lula will do in Brazil. But I'll say I'm a Brazilian, and we had an election recently, and I kept receiving from different types of people variations of this map, and there's sort of two variations of them. Some came from my right-wing family members. They would say things like this, which actually comes from the Bolsonaro son and campaign manager about saying there's sort of a radical left that is sort of spreading itself through the continent, and Brazil has to sort of fight back. Or let's say what I would get from my left-leaning college friends. It would be something, and this comes from the official account of the Workers' Party, Lula's party, saying, oh, look, there is left-wing parties are taking over, and what this says in Portuguese is the hope for Latin America is reborn, right? And even though it's not, again, I said it's not the most academic or serious thing to think about here, is I think there's some sort of degree of people latch on because there's some degree of truth in here, right? Which is, there's a group of people who are unsatisfied with the way with sort of the economic model or the framework for economic policy that has been in place in Latin America for the last 30 years. And now they see now it's a time that, we're all going to get together and change. And then there's also people who are worried about it. I would say sometimes with good reason. There were gains that were made in the last 30 years, right? And that's where I'm going to start. So I'll talk a little bit about this, sort of the last 30 years of Latin American economic development very briefly. And then I'll talk about, some things about the future and how COVID sort of helps us think about that, right? So I'll have this very simple graph. It's just the GDP per capita on the whole continent as a whole, right? And what is sort of striking when you see this, the average, income per person of the average Latin American throughout this period, you can sort of clearly see, at least I can clearly see, 3 periods here, which is, there was this period in the 1960s, 1980s that, the government was very involved in economic life. They would sort of protect industries, allocate resources, and the whole idea is that is sort of by government policy we're going to make this continent an industrial continent, right, and make it developed. At some point, this system stopped working, and that was in the 80s. So in the aftermath of the oil shocks and the interest rates rising in the US, Latin America went through what we call now today sort of the lost decade, this sort of period where incomes didn't move at all, didn't get bigger at all in the whole 1980s. And now there's a period that I sort of labeled myself here the Washington Consensus period. I'll tell you a bit what Washington Consensus means. And sort of want to perhaps making a sort of wild prediction about the future here is that I think when Latin American economic history is taught many years from now, they'll use these terms, and the Washington Consensus period was sort of about to end now, and something new that I don't know what it is, and I don't think anybody really knows what it is about to start. So we really are in sort of this critical juncture, and I think sort of the crisis that's going to end this period is this sort of dip in income you can see here, which is the COVID pandemic, right? So that's sort of so I'll tell you a bit what is the sort of very briefly what is the Washington Consensus, right? So see, in Latin America, I think people don't use the term Washington Consensus that often anymore. People say neoliberal or neoliberalism. That's, to me at least, is too vague, too broad. So I want to use the term Washington Consensus. And the story behind it is there was, around the late 80s, there was many Latin American countries were doing all sorts of structural reforms around their economic policies. There was this big conference at the IMF World Bank. This economist named John Williamson, he wrote down the 10 principles of what the reforms that were taking place at the time were. There's some debate to the degree whether Williamson, or more importantly, the United States or the IMF, saw this as a policy to be pushed into Latin America, or whether that's just a description of what Latin American countries decided to do on itself. But you can sort of have a sense of what it is. It's things about, say, trying to keep debt under control, having market exchange rates that are set by markets and not by government decisions, allowing trade liberalization, opening for direct investment, which basically saying Latin America should be part of the big global system that Miguel was talking about, and there would be gains to participate in that, privatizing companies, deregulation, etc. There's also a big sort of debate on to which degree this is a good description of what most Latin American countries are doing. So I took this whole table out of a paper by these co-authors here. And what they did is they put darker colors for the countries they say they believed actually did this. So they say when you see this whiter color here, what they're telling us that Brazil didn't really engage in opening up to trade, but it did engage in opening up to foreign direct investment. And you can also see like Chile is the one that sort of engaged the most with this sort of policy framework, etc. That's sort of the idea of this Washington Consensus. So I'll try to talk a little bit sort of how do you think was the performance of this Latin American economies during this period, right? And what I'll kind of land on is that there's sort of like glass half full, glass half empty. There was a lot of advances. It is true things sort of stopped working as well in recent periods, and COVID was the big shock that I think is going to have to force people to change things. But before I do that, just let me give one aside, which is, again, I'll call it Washington Consensus period, the last 30 years from 1990 until the eve of the COVID pandemic. But one thing I'll make an aside is this is also the period where, after the third wave of democratization hit Latin America, right? So many countries you can see in the map here switch into, autocracy to democracy around the 80s. And in the case of, say, Central America, there are many instances, where civil conflicts ended, or in case of Peru and Ecuador, Peru and Colombia, insurgents were sort of ended into some peace agreement. So it's also a period of a lot of democracy and a lot of peace in this continent. So sort of part of I think what of the payoffs that we're seeing here will be the dividends of peace and the dividends of democracy, right? So I'll go fairly quick here. So I put these two graphs, but it's not essential to kind of go through them then in that much detail. Is one thing I'll say is, by all sorts of development indicators, there was a lot of progress in this sort of 30 years from 90 to 2010, 1990 to 2019 in the country. So here I'm plotting child mortality rates. There was it fell throughout the 90s to the 2000s. There was sort of this convergence. The countries who were doing the worst, like Bolivia, Brazil, Colombia, catched up to the countries who were doing better, like Argentina and Chile. To some extent, there was a continuation of a process that has been happening throughout the world since then, but that's in some dimensions, these things have been getting better. A lot of countries got much better at providing education. So I guess the very first thing you want to do if you want to have a decent education system is make sure the very young kids are in school, those age 5 to 12. So some countries didn't have their act together even in 1990, like Brazil, Colombia, Bolivia, and this country did this. So there's actual improvements, in education, in healthcare. There has been also fairly strong improvements into sort of poverty. So even the people at the bottom of the income distribution. So I'm plotting 2 graphs for you guys here. One uses the share of population living under $2.15 a day, which is what the World Bank called the international poverty line, their main headline number. Again, today only 4% or so of Latin Americans live under this poverty line. But so I'm also plotting a one that's sort of closer to what, say, the government of Mexico or the government of Brazil would call their poverty lines, so sort of the $6.85 a day. And you can also see there was sort of decline, but then also, there's a flattening towards the end here. And again, I think there's 2 things going on here. One is, as GDP was growing, people are lifted out of poverty. But also, this is a period where redistribution became much more aggressive in big countries in Latin America. So I guess the key example here will be Bolsa Familia in Brazil, or the Progreso Oportunidades in Mexico. There's, some big countries in Latin America become much better at kind of making targeted cash transfers to its poorest populations. I'll go back to this. Also, I think, and this is the thing I think surprised a lot of people, is most countries in Latin America, they actually became a little bit more equal throughout the period, right? So this plots the Gini index, and if you know what it is, it's a number that goes from 0, which is kind of a country that is idealistically, as equal as it can be, and 1 would be a country where one person has all the income, right? And you can kind of see it's a little modest, but you can see all these countries, they sort of, in Latin America, they sort of fall down. So there's sort of modest sort of decrease in inequality, becoming more equal. At the same time, Latin America still is, by international standards, a very unequal place in the world. So I just put Germany here, sort of some sort of representative European country, to see, like, even though there was a drop in inequality, it still falls much short from what you sort of perceive as a more equal society, like, say, the average European country is. Like, and the United States would be somewhere like here, for example, right? Still. And I think here this JW touches a little bit on what is, I think, why I believe people were already dissatisfied with this Washington consensus era and what it was delivering to people in Latin America at this time. There was improvement, but the improvement is not sort of big enough to lead to our aspirations to become a more equal society or even a richer society. And one way I'll try to make this point is returning again to a graph of GDP per capita. So if you start a little bit here looking at what is happening to Chile and Brazil, you sort of have this lost decade in the 80s. It does grow. So if you look, say, Brazil is richer today than what it was in 1990 and 1980. And Chile, perhaps the fastest growing country in the whole Latin American continent, for sure is much richer today than it was. But there's a sense of, like, if you look outside the world and think, what is in the realm of possibility for, a country to grow amongst other sort of poorer or middle income countries, you have this, much, much more successful places in Asia, right? So one example is, to me, the starkest is South Korea. It's a country that was as rich as Brazil 40 years ago, and now is almost 3 times richer than Brazil, right? Or China, a country that was much poorer than Brazil or Chile or the average Latin American country, and sort of grew so fast, it's now has kind of comparable GDP per capita levels as Brazil. And I think if anyone would take a bet, you would kind of bet that China will leave Brazil behind, and sort of a graph like this will look much like South Korea, like a country that kept growing and leave. So I think, even though I don't think the average Latin American person is checking graphs of GDP per capita, they do have a sense, that there's all these countries in the world that are working and things are growing and they're getting richer, right? It's not like every middle-income country has sort of stuck always being middle-income countries, right? And they sort of perceive as that, like, why can't we do what these other countries do? Why we can't get the outcomes these countries have, right? So say, this tells a little bit, what is the level of discontent, on this. And you can see, for example, Chile had massive protest in 2019, but I think it sort of is people satisfied, that things have stagnated, that Chile has not become an equal society that they wanted it to be, and so forth. Now, I can switch now to talk about sort of the big shock that I think is the shock that sort of is gonna sort of end this period, which is the COVID-19 pandemic. So this is a picture of a cemetery in Manaus, in Brazil. So And I have like 3 takeaways about the COVID pandemic in Latin America. And I'll try to now switch gears. I've been talking to the past, now talk a bit forward, like how this 3 takeaways should inform what we want for the economic policy, for social policy, for thinking about what we Latin America needs. So the first one is in terms of just like number of people dying or proportional population dying, Latin America is probably one of the hardest hit places in the world. I think the only place in the world, part of the world, that was as hard hit on, say, number of deaths as COVID is Russia and the Eastern Europe former Soviet bloc, right? When you get data that, tries to use excess deaths instead of official statistics, so it tries to be comparable across countries, etc., you see like the sort of mortality from COVID in Latin America is way higher than it was in the US, in Europe, in Africa, in Asia, right? It's really, other than Russia and the former Soviet bloc, is the country where, like, say, the most people in the world have died. So it was, and the burden of that is all on the poor people, on indigenous communities, on the people of African descent. I think it exacerbates inequalities, right? So I had some data on that. It's a lot of numbers, but I said what I meant. Sort of, if you sort of go to The Economist, try to get their data that compares estimated excess deaths per COVID throughout the world, what you're going to see is that Latin America sort of was hit really hard, right? Which I think is a point it does. So that's my first takeaway. Like, we should think, other global health crises will happen, unfortunately, in the future, right? And you have to think, why is it that things work so poorly in Latin America, right? Even though it's not obvious to me at all why it is, right? Ex ante wouldn't have been. I'll very briefly talk about my 2 other takeaways. The first is how redistribution was responded to the pandemic. And here I picked 2 countries as example, Peru and Brazil. The top one in blue is Peru, and you sort of see what you expect. When the COVID pandemic hits in 2020, this is poverty rates, right? The poverty rates in Peru just increases, of course. Like, people have to stay at home, there's social distancing, there's economic crisis. That's sort of what expected, even though the magnitudes are really impressive. In Brazil, it actually falls, which is a thing that happened also in the US, is poverty rates fell during the pandemic because the response from the government was very sort of aggressive. Like, it was created a whole system of transferring money to people who are unemployed, people who are poor, or sometimes people who are even that poor, given the way the system works. And I think this is a thing that I think is probably going to inform how these countries move forward, right? So people in Brazil, like, for sure what happened is you can't go back now to the original levels. Like, so it seems very clear now, the discussions happening today between Lula and Congress is, the level of support, the level of transfer, that sort of progressiveness of the redistribution in Brazil is going to change for a long time now, because you can't go back to what it was pre-pandemic. And what I don't really know, but perhaps will happen, is countries like Peru say, we need to have the setup that, say, Brazil has or Mexico has, like the state capacity to deliver money to people when they're in need. Or else when the next crisis hits us, right? So I think there'll be a world that happens a little bit more often. That's my second takeaway. My third takeaway, and this is where we have the least data on, is the following, which is the learning losses for students in Latin America were most likely massive, even though we don't know data. So the first graph I'm trying to convey a little bit is Latin America actually did a very poor job of teaching its children before the pandemic, right? So here it's sort of plotting, basically test scores of kids versus the GDP per capita. And you can also say, just pick one country like Brazil, the average Brazilian student sort of performs at the level of a much poorer country like India instead of a sort of similar income country like China, right? So given its level of development, Brazil actually does a very poor job of Brazil and other South America does a very poor job of teaching kids. And one thing I think that perhaps a lot of people don't know is Latin America was one of the places of the world where schools were closed for the longest time in the whole world, right? So again, I tried to data for the whole continent and I couldn't. One number I found is in Brazil, the average school was closed for 78 weeks. That's a year and a half of school being closed in a country where people don't have broadband internet, they don't have laptops, which basically means the kids are just at home not learning, right? For 78 weeks. And here there's one graph from one study based on São Paulo state, which is a very particularly rich state for Brazilian and Latin American standards. And also the state that was the first to reopen its schools after a year, right? And it's sort of showing, basically the black line is sort of what you expect people to be learning, assuming people just learn 100 units of learning every year, right? And the dashed line is what you actually observe. So what it's basically telling us is that there was this whole period in 2020 where students learned barely nothing. And after a full year that schools were reopened in the state of São Paulo, the students are still they're scoring when they test them on math, they are performing as if they were, say, 9 months behind, right? Even a full year. So there's not a sense it's here that people are still catching up. And I think there's another thing that has to be addressed. There's a whole generation whose learning has been really impaired, much more, in ways that sort of dwarf the things you read about American students in the New York Times, and that we sort of have to figure out ways to remediate that, right? And I think that's sort of the third takeaway and policy priority that we have for Latin America. I may have a bit a little over time, but yeah, thank you. That's all I want to say. Thank you.
So let me see where I can find my slides. What am I going to? No, I don't know yet. So let's see.
I don't use this kind of laptop.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, I don't know. So I need to turn it off and then.
We're just going to close this.
Oh, okay.
You're welcome.
Okay. So then.
This is yours here.
Yeah, exactly.
There you go.
All right. So yeah, wonderful. Yeah. Okay. So thanks so much for having me. I'm going to preface my presentation by saying I'm very much a glass half full person. I'm born that way. People think that I'm not good at seeing danger or seeing threats, but also because I was there when the glass was empty. So I can see that, well, there is a change, and you can, and also, I have a history of activism, so it's about what to do it, what to do about it, how to fix it. So, my presentation very much parallel what Thomas has done. In Africa as well, there have been a lost decade, but then the GDP per capita from basically 7 have more than double. And it's different when you consider resource-rich countries, at least in terms of GDP per capita. Much higher in resource-rich countries than resource-poor countries. But overall, Africa has been rising. So poverty has been in decline as well, in a very significant way. And you can see the level of decline, in Africa compared to the rest of the world is not necessarily the same rate, but very sharp. What is surprising is that the little impact that COVID-19 has, if you look at, for instance, the projection, from 2019 to 2020, poverty rates were put to be 8.1, but the new projection moved it up to 9.3, which is not very, very significant. So, very much like US and other countries, Africa dealt very, very well with COVID-19. I'm not going to go to the details. The excess death was, relatively low. The lockdown policies and also the mitigating measures were really impressive. So now, this another way to show that we are not expecting much, a very big jump in poverty as a result of COVID-19. So let me go straight to what I think are the key lessons, key drivers. The first one is that the growth in Africa, poverty reduction in Africa, driven by the sector that we don't anticipate will drive growth, which is the service sector. Africa growth has seemed to bypass the manufacturing sector. For instance, the IT, particularly, microcredit, logistics has boomed in many, many countries, particularly places like Kenya, Nigeria, and Ghana. And what thing that we also do not mention enough when we talk about poverty reduction and growth in Africa is institutional development. In fact, if you look at perception of corruption, the number in Africa look very similar to the rest of the world. Actually, it's some of the lowest. But it's very common when you say Africa that people immediately talk about corruption, which is not the reality, in fact. Now, there is a very interesting study done by Michael Kramer showing how the world is converging in terms of institutional quality. If you see, Africa like here and the rest of the world, you can see a big gap in governance and democratic institutions from the 60s to the 90s, but then you see convergence. Africa with the rest of the world, particularly South Asia. Africa is becoming more democratic. Africa is becoming better governed, if you can believe it. At least that's what the data says. So, okay, now I need to talk a bit about what can be done. Because for me, the issue is not about whether, it's about how to speed up the process of growth and poverty alleviation in Africa. And I will surprise you by not talking about cash transfer. I'm not talking about food aid or foreign aid. I'm going to talk about three things. First of all, energy. I think because of the potential that Africa represents in terms of particularly solar energy and other sources of energy, and the fact that some of the rivers with a huge potential in terms of production of energy, like Congo, are massively underused and exploited. So I think investing massively in energy production should be one of the best ways we can actually reduce poverty and accelerate growth in Africa. Transportation as well. I did a study in which I showed that in contrast to the rest of the world, the poorest people in Africa live in places where land quality is at the highest. Why? Because those places don't tend not to have roads. They tend to be isolated. So it's not like Europe, where roads were built, at least during the Roman Empire, to connect cities to places with high agricultural productivity, so that you can you can feed the cities. In Africa, the places with the highest agricultural potential tend to be isolated, and that's where the highest potential for poverty. And the reason also being that the roads that are there today are colonial roads that were built to connect cities to mines, to cash crop, not for agricultural production. So I think there is a major rethinking that needs to be done to improve not only the quality of the roads, but also the quality of the networks, And digital innovation is also massive. It's already going on with, as I said, places like Nigeria, like Kenya, like for instance, the new digital finance revolution, basically have taken roots in places like Nairobi, and many other places. So improving connection, improving access to 3G, 5G, and so on, is one of the best way you can actually not only reduce poverty, but also improve production. And I did a study that I find extremely insightful with a graduate student who is now at Columbia, where we show that there is a negative, places in Africa that have 3G coverage are far less likely to have food insecurity. So when you think of food insecurity, you think of people in desert fleeing, whatever, droughts and all this kind of stuff. You think of, but in fact, in Africa, two things happen. So first of all, if you have 3G and you are in trouble, you can call somebody in the city and say, well, I haven't eaten for 2 days. Can you? And then it comes fast, as per African culture, So I'm waiting for a phone call, So, and then also another thing is people mobilize in cities against those crises. You see a lot of food riots in Africa, and you feel like, well, people who are rioting are hungry. No, they are not hungry. They're actually trying to support places where there is food shortage. So 3G, for instance, can have strong effect on social movements to reduce, threats, major threats anyway. So 3G is very important. Now, governance and human capital is also very important. In terms of governance, so there is progress on democratization across Africa, but democracy needs to be deepened to include better participation, better involvement, better agency of population, particularly at a local level, and include, for instance, e-governance to reduce corruption and to improve transparency in government. So this is already happening, everywhere. One of the corruption happens in many African countries at local level through procurement. With e-governance, you can actually solve the problem by making those transactions more transparent. Participation, transparency, it's very key. Now, I mentioned human capital. You'll think that I'm going to talk about primary school, primary education, which is true. But I think for me, what is needed the most in Africa is the upper tail human capital. You need, for instance, not only you need like major research centers, major think tanks. You need agricultural production not just to be at the cutting edge. New seeds, new technologies. So that African farmers can not only feed the local population, but also be very competitive on the global market, in products like soybeans and other products that can come from Africa. That's how you can reduce poverty. So it's really important that when we talk about human capital, it's not just building basic skills. It's also about really setting up big cutting-edge frontier research centers in STEM, in agriculture, in humanities, and so on. So this is very, very important. I can elaborate on that during Q&A. I'm part of this trend, because I set up a School of Economics across the continent that aim at playing this role. And to see how fast things can change, a student from that school came here 5 years ago. Here at Princeton is now a professor at NYU. So it shows that you can actually, when you create the system, when you provide the level of ambition and drive needed, even in a very poor place, you can move up very, very quickly. You can get people at the frontier. So there is an example of citizen engagement in public good provision that I don't think I'll have time to talk about. I'm doing an experiment in Nigeria, for instance, where economic policies will be designed not by the mayor or by the governor, but there is by some kind of education summit involving all the key stakeholders that to have more information, but also more agency in sort of what people need. And what is interesting is that this process led to doubling of education budget and also citizens raising money on their own so that they can compensate for any gap that may exist in funding in the population. So this is democracy, but not just like elections, not just like who wins or lose, but improving citizenship, participation at local level. So to finish, I said three things. So first, that Africa is rising, particularly for the last 30 years, and this parallel what Thomas has said, that even if most of the growth happen in resource-rich countries, they are not necessarily the places where the poverty is declining the most. The poverty is declining in places that are resource poor, like places like Ghana, places like Kenya, So, and then surprisingly, we were not as hard hit as with COVID-19 as many people might have expected, which is also a sign of the fact that Africa is better governed than it used to. And then the service sector in Africa is actually driving the growth, which is a bit counterintuitive because we are all supposed to go from agriculture to manufacturing and to service, but well, it's not happening that way necessarily. So, and then for solution, I focus on energy infrastructure, whether it's physical infrastructure, digital infrastructure, and more importantly, improvement of the institutions and human capital. Not human capital basic, human capital upper tail as well as basic. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm going to invite our speakers to sit now, preferably behind your name, so I'll tell you who's who.
Okay. Let me see.
Tomas, Miguel.
Okay, I'm here. Okay.
So it's time to open it up for questions that people might have for our speakers. Yes, Federico. Thank you. And can I just say also, just to reiterate, speak loudly. You know what? I will play the post. Make sure you don't do this. And as Federico is speaking, you could raise your hand.
Thank you, Deborah. My name is Federico Fabbrini. I'm a law professor in Dublin, Ireland, and currently on sabbatical as a fellow in law here at Princeton. I want to thank all the speakers for a great presentation. And I wanted to ask a question to Miguel, because you touched on a concept which is really the buzzword, at least from a European perspective, which is this concept of resilience. And in the Brussels speak, it's all about resilience, how Europe should have learned from the pandemic and become more resilient. But at the same time, there was another sort of a keyword that was used a lot in policy debates, and that's foresight. And so I wanted to ask you to what extent your project and sort of the research you have done can provide any food for thought on the foresightedness of a system. Are we only facing the crisis when they arrive and we need to be resilient, or can we anticipate them? Is it just a learning by doing, or are there some sort of structural features that we can embed into the system to make it also capable to anticipate a crisis rather than just resist when it arrives?
So much. Let me just see for the moment, are there any other questions that you want to put on the table now? Because if not, maybe that very same question could be posed to the panel in terms of thinking about foresight and resilience, both at the systemic level for Miguel, but also in terms of Latin America and Africa. I think we have different examples of that, both globally and regionally.
I actually think that foresight might get us into trouble. And I'll tell you why. If we take complexity seriously, predicting where the next perturbation is going to take place is going to be impossible. Moreover, it would take a level of microanalysis to see who would have predicted it was the Vegas real estate, who would have predicted it was Wuhan, who would have predicted whatever. So spending a lot of money, sorry to say this will cost people jobs in Brussels, but spending a lot of money trying to predict where the next one will come from, I don't think is going to get us very far. And in fact, and this is a characteristic of complex systems, by preparing for the wrong thing, you might actually create a crisis in and of itself. I think what we need to do is just, and it's very expensive, but we have to be open and ready for all sorts of crises. And that might mean that we might have parallel efforts. For example, COVID, the tragedy of the millions of deaths aside, the big danger from COVID wasn't necessarily the deaths, it was the strain on the health system. Really trying to create systems with a much larger margin of error that are not so focused on optimizing for efficiency in present, but actually leave some room for error or disaster later on. Right, yeah.
You want to?
Yeah, so I don't think I have a lot to add to me. I think that sort of is the main insight. It's the sort of the world is too complex, right, to sort of foresee things, right? So one way to think about it is sort of the same way you think about, say, choosing assets in a portfolio, right? It's like we can't predict every single outcome and buy the stocks like, oh, I think maybe this, but you just diversify, right? So I think part of the issue is when a lot of, like, say, if there's one thing in the world we all use and it's all built in one place, it's a little besides the point if we think that place is in trouble or not. Because, the idea is like, if all our microchips come from one place and then that place goes on lockdown, then we run out of microchips. Right? So this idea, like, you have to diversify, and many countries have to do the same thing. And that, I guess, it's essentially what Miguel said. That has an efficiency cost. We're not doing it all in the place that does it the most efficient, right? But there's room for that, like when shocks happen, right? I say when we need vaccines, they're not all done in, Michigan and Mumbai and, some small town in Germany, right? There's somewhere in Colombia or Brazil, there's also can put vaccines into vials. Yeah.
Yeah. So okay, for me, crisis is also about institutions to cope. It's also about psychology. For instance, I went to an argument with my family when they told me, based on the book of one of my colleagues from UCSD, saying that U.S. is at the eve of civil war, something. And I was like, I went to Costco 2 weeks ago, everybody seemed fine. Everybody was saying, well, so I don't, it's not like, they're preparing for anything, people are just happy, they're having fun. So, yeah, we'll be fine, So, yeah, yeah. And the last election, I went back to them and said, you see, the guy I saw at Costco, they actually were acting normally, we were not. Anyway, so institutions, we tend to forget that, democracy came in many, many places out of civil war. Because we have ways sometimes to see what we have done and not want to repeat the same thing. We sometimes want to come to an agreement and set up institutions to prevent future crises from happening. And some of the most solid democracies today in the world came out of conflict, came out of major conflict, domestic, sometimes international. So I think for me, it's important, first of all, not to overly do it, but tend to downplay a little bit individual level so that we don't feel like we are about to die, And then second is to be very innovative, creative, instead of, we don't know exactly how we can cope, but we can put together a process in which, if it happens, we are more likely to get out of it than less, So, and I think if, legal, institutional framework are created, I think it will make the solution more likely to emerge than less.
Can I just add one thing? Sure. You may have noticed that there were two semi-optimistic scenarios, and then I'm going to change my name to Cassandra. this is not to deny, look, life expectancy has increased worldwide by 20 years since I was born. There is no question that we're living at probably the best time, and at least in material goods. What I'm interested in is the fact that we have so much anxiety. Whether you measure it by the psychotropic drugs that undergraduates are taking, or you notice that the only films that make any money are disaster movies or horror movies. I think we are dealing with this age of anxiety, and I think one of the reasons is that we realize we have it really good, but we're getting close to the cliff. So I don't deny the positives. I just think, I guess I'm just worried about, it's like the coyote, and we run over the cliff, and then we, poof.
I don't know how you follow up on that, but let me just make one observation if I could, and then I want to bring in two other people who have questions, which is in some senses, of course, it's an impossible question to answer in the context of we have arguments that are being pitched at a systemic level against arguments that are looking at regional variation. And so part of what I think is really interesting and important is that we can look at overall patterns, but we also have to recognize that there's variation that's happening in the context of global crises that are priming us all, number one. And number two, temporality in these comments matter, which is that short-term fixes, which of course you have to be optimistic and forward-thinking to respond, can have unintended consequences. And then third, and related to temporality, is that the multiplier effect and diffusion happens much more quickly now than it happened before. We've always been globalized, well, not always. We have been globalized for a long time. You only have to think about empire and colonialism to think about that. But the pace at which things that happen in Ukraine can affect the dynamics in other places along the terms of the slide that Miguel noted is so much quicker that pace, that temporality and multiplier effect is so much more intense. So in a way, thinking globally against those regional variations, I think is really critical. And, thinking about optimism while also recognizing unintentional effects, I think is great. And by the way, I didn't plan the pessimism and optimism part, but that's great. So time is, of course, is getting away, but let me just bring in Ben and Zia. I think those are the two people who'd raised their hands, and then we'll give I'm sorry, and then I don't know your name? And then Jack, so maybe three quick questions, and then we'll give our panelists the final word. Ben.
I wanted to pick up on one of the points that Leonard made, but I think it speaks across the three speakers, which is the role of manufacturing. Leonard was saying that manufacturing is not particularly important in the African growth story. But we know when we think about the resilience of supply chains and concerns about global fragility that more localized manufacturing is critical. We know that manufacturing is critical for more inclusive forms of growth, or at least has been historically. I'm wondering, both regionally and globally, how the speakers think about the role of manufacturing and industrial production as kind of responses to this contemporary phase. Thomas even suggests that we might be in a new kind of phase of political economy of globalization, which I'm very open to as well. Where does manufacturing fit in?
Zia.
Over this period of growth. And similarly, we've seen what's been happening in Latin America. So, this idea of the old political economy And at the same time, the recognition that that is tied through the rest of the global system to actually creating different kinds of precarity. It seems to me a kind of key thing that we need to perhaps focus some attention on. The second part of it is that you wouldn't know from anybody who spoke that military expenditure has increased dramatically in recent years. And there is no prospect of it going down now for the foreseeable future. And with that comes a whole different set of the generation of precarity collectively, which will be expressed regionally within civil wars, wars between states, and hegemonic wars with catastrophic consequences that also go hand in hand with this. So I was just struck by these two factors that seem to have been missed.
These two, in conversation with each other, these two comments are great. And then Jack.
Pretty similar to that last comment. I just wanted to ask what you think the role of education is when discussing these kinds of existential threats. I think there's a real risk, especially when it comes to climate change, where you can be completely honest, but in doing so, you might give people anxiety and they might run away from said truth and possibly lose the will to action. I think that's a very real psychological risk. So I just wanted to get your take on that.
Thank you. Three excellent questions. Should we do them in reverse order this time?
Okay, sure. Why not? So it's like fine. So so I'm trying to get better at being pessimistic, but I'm trying, but I'm not there yet. But no, okay. So regarding manufacturing, given that the service sector in particular, the digital economy is growing in Africa, I think it shows that maybe the growth in Africa, because it's service-based, particularly digital, can be more environmental friendly. And then I talk about solar energy being essential, for investment. So that's also a very, very good sign. And okay, but let me also say that, throughout history, the service sector has been always strong in Africa, particularly with domestic trade involving mostly women. So basically there were a small version of Amazon, across African history, So so I think those are all like good signs. Now, regarding the discussion about energy and global warming, it was implicit in what I said because as I just said, I was focusing on mostly on when I took energy, I said solar. When I talk about sectoral, I mentioned service, not hardcore manufacturing. And the fact that many African countries, for instance, are turning their back on the push from China to have sweatshops across the continent, it's a good sign that people are going the right direction. So, okay, let me put it this way. Basically, I don't buy too much this stuff that when it gets hot, people start killing each other, like the link between global warming and whatever conflict. I mean, conflict, basically, environmental failure is failure of institutions. So we need, and I think when we are talking about democracy, institutional change in Africa, to think about how we create institutions that are resilient to conflict. Participation is a good way, dialogue, good ways, democratization, decentralization are good way. So this is what we can do, and I think, okay, particularly when it comes to Africa, there is too much negativity, like if you read this, you will feel like, is that real? Like Africa is actually growing, like people are not about to disappear, So I think it's really important that without, minimizing the risk, without minimizing the threats, that we recognize progress that have been made and focus on specific things that can be done to accelerate the process and to mitigate the threat. And this is what my presentation was focused on.
Yeah. Okay. So again, let me start again with the manufacturing, right? So in a way, there's like there's sort of a very plain vanilla economics. The thing you learn in the first grade class, which is you should just let countries specialize in the thing they want to specialize, and they'll do better. So if the comparative advantage of Chile is to mining copper, and if the comparative advantage of Brazil is growing soybeans, that's what they should do, and then we'll buy the manufactured goods from China. There's no shouldn't worry about whether a country is manufactured or not. I think that missed one point, and I think that probably the place where where it misses a lot is the United States. It's there was a sense there was this good jobs that you could get without a college degree in this country, and they were all in manufacturing, right? And when they disappeared, the bottom fell down for a good third of this country, and then politically their views changed, and they elected the people they wanted to elect. So the whole society has been dealing with that, the sort of good jobs that come, and I think that's probably true in other countries in the world, like in Latin America, in Asia, in Africa. Like you probably need those. Saying that, I don't know exactly what you do with this information. At the same time, I think it's probably good to have more manufacturing countries. It supports a type of job, a type of society. Unions play a role politically. It's the political reality of when a government says, let's now do something to industrialize our country, is very tricky, right? Like I'm Brazilian. When a Brazilian politician says that, you immediately reach for your wallet, right? You think like, well, you know what this means? This means a subsidy to a superconductor microchip plant in the middle of the Amazon that makes very little, right? The political economy is very fraught with, capture and lobbying, and it's very difficult. I think I think that's a very complex issue. I don't have a good answer, which is there's good arguments that industrial policy should happen, and we should get manufacturing to be more have more manufacturing in these middle income countries. But when that happens in practice, it usually gets there's all sorts of ways for political reasons this don't work, right? So I don't have a great answer here. The other question, I think I'll take it more as a question on climate change, and
Maybe just 1 minute, so Miguel
yeah,
also has
and I'll say this: it is like a very, it is complicated. I think the main issue here is what Miguel said: is we live in a world that's not dealt to do with global issues, right? And this is the global issue, right? In this, one thing I'll push back is I think we now clearly live in a world that's not anymore a one-to-one translation between GDP and growth and emissions, right? This is certainly true for the rich countries in the world. Like, the rich countries, they keep growing and their emissions keep falling, right? And we should be able to do this for the rest of countries in the world. There's no sense, I think, to deal with climate change, we should grow less or degrowth. So I think that's a little bit of a false dichotomy, right? So there's a sense of, I'll say that. But I think the main issue is the things Miguel said. It's a global issue. It requires, right, coordination, to both cut emissions to preserve our forests, and the global, right, the Westphalian world is too unprepared for that. Yeah.
Manufacturing, very quickly, I think the idea that you're going to grow yourself by having a big steel plant, that's dead. Manufacturing is a race to the bottom, and the robots will always be cheaper and less problematic. I think what we have to do is stop thinking about return. And also, we have environmental problem. Yeah. I mean, we're running out of stuff to put in, and we're running out of places to put the garbage that we produce. I think the real question is not bringing back manufacturing jobs, is making high school teachers, nurses, and aides at senior homes pay more. Why we have this sort of 19th century Marxist that you should only earn a decent wage if your muscles are rippling. Well, that's crazy. We can't afford to have that, and I don't think it's a good strategy. So on the environment, I totally agree. On the education, my only response to that is we have to stop making education a luxury good. We're seeing in this country the best predictor of political outcomes has now become education. And I think, and I castigate Princeton for this, we sit up here and we produce excellence, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, our leverage is getting less and less and less because we're becoming more and more of a niche good. And I think that is what we should be addressing, making education much more democratic.
Thank you. So let me just, even though the clap came, let me just say a couple of minutes. First of all, of course, we want to thank our panelists, not for resolving the problems as much as opening up questions for us to consider. And I think this point of moving beyond this idea that the solutions and the problems all reside within a nation state, and presuming that it is only the state that can engage in one policy versus another is the way to go, has been highlighted by this need to think about the global context within which these things are occurring. And by the way, SSRC for many years hosted something called Anxieties of Democracy, precisely because countries on their own, even if they're democratic, to come back to Leonard's point, can't always resolve questions that require global cooperation, and cooperation that extends beyond the term of an elected official who has other incentives to promote policy. So first off, I want to thank you all for helping us to think about that. Secondly, our colleagues have forced us to really think about human nature and the degree to which they are nasty, brutish, and short, or the degree to which they are cooperative and unlikely to come up with solutions. But I think this is important, especially for those of us coming from political science and sociology and economics, which is represented on this panel, because at the end of the day, individuals don't operate absent other individuals, and they don't operate absent institutions. I think that's something all of us in different ways have highlighted and noted, but not just institutions, again, at the local or national level, but in the context of international cooperation. So we have not solved the problems, but we've opened up many conversations. I hope we continue them going forward, and thank you all.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's right.
I like your periodization.